Have you ever tried to figure out why you are in a given scenario and you get a specific result as a consequence of specific behavior multiple times over again, and it's an undesirable result, yet you still do the same things and still get the same results, and you have no idea why? The first time I found out I got cancer, well, the second time technically, but the first time in years that I found out that I had cancer, which was when it came back, I remember I found out and I was like completely disassociated from the entire reality of what I had just heard in that moment. And I didn't really hit me until years after that, whenever I started to experience some of the more tragic results of chemotherapy treatments and social implications behind all of the things that came behind my physical appearance as a consequence of steroid medications and stuff like this. And even then, it was reactionary to social circumstances and other things that didn't really have anything to do with the fact that I was going to die. I was like completely detached. And, that changed later on into the future with other things and other experiences. But that's a different story for another time. The whole issue here is you are in this sort of makeshift prison that you have built for yourself. Maybe not intentionally. In fact, that's kind of the whole point. It has not been intentionally, more than likely. If you're anything like me in this regard, in my estimation, this is more than likely because you were raised in a way that no one ever sort of cultivated critical thinking skills within you. More than likely, maybe you grew up in an environment where you would ask why. You had your childhood curiosity. You would ask questions. You would try to explore things as a child naturally does. And you were shut down and you were just told to do as you're told and speak when spoken to. And, children are to be seen and not heard. And all these other frankly destructive ideas that parents propagate across generations of children because they don't have the patience to deal with childlike curiosity and exploration, and it gets obnoxious, but it's part of it. I have a son who's about to be 4 years old, so believe me, I know from a parental standpoint that it can get obnoxious, but it's part of it. This has to be cultivated. If this was not cultivated in you from childhood, and especially if it was essentially the opposite, then there's no wonder we have so many mental health disorders or such a big mental health epidemic, let's say, a lot of psychiatric and psychological situations. We're surrounded by a lot of psychological instability in society. This starts in the home with the parents, including mine and including yours. My lack of a father played into it as well. Technically had several father figures who were in and out of the picture, but firstly, none of them were necessarily positive nor role models. And furthermore, they were all temporary. And none of them ever, I think one out of them all, through my entire lifetime, my mom's entire dating career, there was one man who actually did something to help in this way. And even he was extremely destructive. There was another man who was actually a good dude that I valued for his character ethically. Jason Davis. Good dude. Just wasn't right for my mom specifically. But the other guy taught me to think for myself, even though he wasn't the one that actually facilitated the growth in that regard. He told me the words to think for myself. They're these lessons that I'm returning to as a conscious adult now that I am aware and can reflect on them and be like, wow, there's some wisdom in that. But was he the one that helped induce the epiphany to get me to this point? Absolutely not. And so, as I was saying a minute ago, I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how do I go about inducing an epiphany to get someone to truly realize that they have been asleep and to help wake them up so they can save their own lives and help themselves escape the prison that they have subconsciously and inadvertently built around themselves that has more than likely been had the fan that has more than likely had the foundation laid since childhood. So the genesis and outline of my situation, like I said, since I was a kid, it was always just, because I said so. There were no explanations, no negotiations. There was nothing that was supposed to have taken place that is conducive to a healthy childhood development, psychologically speaking. We're not even talking about the socioeconomic stuff. We're not talking about anything else, even in the family dynamic or just regarding the child's psyche. I mean, just purely from a developmental standpoint, we were malnourished, me and my brother both. Thankfully, my life has gone a little different than his. It's been a much more difficult, I would say, even objectively speaking, than his in a lot of ways. But that's paid. Nothing in life that's worth having is not going to mandate that you suffer for it. And so I'm thankful for that, genuinely. But he hasn't been so lucky. And he's trapped in his ideology with little hope of getting out. I don't want to say no hope because, well, that's just depressingly cynical, but pretty damn close to that. Nonetheless, I escaped. So how did I escape, right? That's the question. That's the grand question. That's the question that I kept trying to really pinpoint to an origin, to a single event, to something that would help me figure out how to actually process this as a lesson and to be able to bestow it upon other people as wisdom to genuinely help somebody who is in a similar position. And while I have not discovered any sort of concrete answers, largely because I think that would be a little difficult to do, especially in a cookie cutter kind of way that would effectively apply to, a large amount of other people. So what I've tried to do and what I've come to present for you here in this video today is some key points in my development, specifically regarding these things in mind, and leave them for you to reflect on a little bit, see what resonates, discard what doesn't, and hopefully there is insight or an epiphany, ideally, to be discovered within the context and the content. So, broadly speaking, in order to get into this, I have to introduce officially, I've mentioned it here and there in other videos, which I'll link somewhere in this one, but Project 1121 is what I've come to call it. It started off as just 1121. Actually, it started off not even having a title. It just started off as a single catalyst epiphany, and then turned into eventually 1121, the number. And then that has reached a point now, after making a couple of videos and seriocomically titling one of the timestamps in one of the videos recently, Project 1121, and the title resonated, so I decided to run with it. And so now that's what this has come to represent, Project 1121. So what is Project 1121? The short answer to that question is essentially that Project 1121 represents growth, development, and passion, especially and primarily with respect to my own personal development, evolution, growth, sustained and cultivated, integrated selfhood, basically. That's a little bit long-winded and a bit wordy, but it'll make a little more sense here in just a moment. So basically, the breakdown of this Project 1121 is, throughout my life, all through my childhood and into adulthood, early adulthood, I did not have the ability to think for myself. This has been beat like a dead horse in other videos, like several of the other videos, some of which I don't even think I've posted. I've mentioned it a lot. So that should be obvious to anybody who watches the channel. If you don't watch the channel, well, yeah, I used to be very non-cognizant, couldn't think for myself, couldn't think critically, etc., etc. So as an adult, you can imagine how this would be a problem. I mean, look at contemporary Western culture, society, the culture war, all the things that are going on around us right now that, primarily conservatives have a problem with, but frankly, everybody has a problem with. Anybody who's not just radical and completely out of their minds and even halfway reasonable. We see it everywhere around us right now. So, this is a problem, not just individually, but in society. I was part of that problem. And I became aware of this problem internally within myself the very first time, as a consequence of being in a relationship with somebody who was conscious, who is conscious. And I had never had anyone in my life who was like that. That was one of the many traits that she embodied that was completely first for me, not just in terms of like a relationship, but in terms of a person in my life, period. And think about that, to be a full adult, almost 20 years old, and you've never had anybody in your life who is conscious to help try to bring that out of you and cultivate that in you. I mean, I'm sure I've met people who were. Obviously, that would be completely absurd to assume otherwise, but nobody to where it would have actually mattered or made any sort of difference, or certainly that I would have realized. I mean, I'm sure there were people like that who were conscious in at least among the staff of some of the facilities I was locked up in growing up, at least within one of those environments, I would imagine. But either way, all sorts of events, like tragic experiences to me internally, like subjectively, happened over the course of, we'll call it 6 years. That's an estimate, and that's counting just starting to get on drugs to having a son and, being on the process of getting off of drugs and transforming myself and my life into what it has sprung towards evolving into as of today, which is it's still an ongoing process, but there's certainly after a particular point in time within this journey, there's got to be a divider. Like, okay, like here's a good enough place to establish the marker for when I can safely say this is when I changed officially, like my whole life. And I would put that marker right around the birth of my son, or rather around the discovery of the pregnancy of my son's mother, because of reasons that I've highlighted in other stories on the channel, which again will be linked in this video. Each epiphany I had, starting with the one which came as a consequence of losing a relationship with somebody who was conscious and who I had developed something with, that upon losing it shattered my world like nothing ever before. It almost forced the awakening out of me in just one respect. Now, I'm starting from a significant deficit here. Grown men with no conscious awareness. That's, first of all, it's a scary thought in general, but we're starting from a heavy deficit. So there's the first epiphany. Well, then, there's another video about my relationship history. You could check that out, and there's a reason that I've done specific videos in specific orders. And there will be, the more videos I put out, the more all of it will start to tie together and make sense. But the relationship played a heavy part. This latter relationship, the second one in the video, if you go watch it or if you've seen it, and if you haven't, I'll just go ahead and summarize my second committed serious monogamous relationship is the one that I count, really the only one that I count, and she's the one who is the mother of my son now. And it's gone on for over 5 years. Stop and go, all kinds of complicated nuance in between. So every epiphany, as I was saying a moment ago, that came behind this relationship, right? Because in some shape, form, or fashion, for the most part, at least for the first several epiphanies within the Project 1121, were induced as a byproduct of some sort of consequence that I had to face as a result of my actions within the relationship dynamic, which typically was me massively, excuse my language, this one time fucking up multiple times, and then finally it becoming too much and pushing past the point of no return from a certain perspective. And the loss, it felt like grief, like genuine grief each time one of these things happened. And I actually, it's almost as if I was forced to draw the lesson out of it each time, at least one, because there's a lot of lessons that could be drawn out of each of these scenarios, especially the more I journal and reflect on my experiences in this way. There's a lot there. That's why in the last video, I shared at the end, I specifically had spoken about the value of considering these experiences in the light of what can I extract from this, because personally, which I, of course, and this is also something I acknowledged in the video, it's different being on my side of personal life experience in terms of drawing wisdom out of the experiences. Yet there's a reason why people write memoirs and biographies, and there's a reason why likewise people read those memoirs and biographies. So, not to get too much off topic there, but there's a lot in these, but just one is all that I needed against my will. But see, after a point, we reach a time where, okay, I'm starting to gain more awareness. I, at least at the very minimum, have more self awareness in certain respects. Even if I have no self respect, no self value or love, even if I'm just basically waiting to die, expecting to die at any given point in time, don't care if I live or die, living absolutely recklessly as a consequence of these internal thoughts, which is why your self talk and self perception and quality of thought matters, or quality of your thoughts matters. Yeah, matters, correct. After a certain point, it was around that time. Excuse me. It was around the time where I found out that I was going to have a son, that epiphany specifically, and this is why I put the marker here a minute ago in the video, is because this epiphany in particular brought a new level of awareness. And I think partially that was due to the fact that a whole significant portion of this particular epiphany was a result of quitting the drug usage, because I was on a lot of drugs all the time. Again, something I've beat to death in previous videos. That had, I think, a lot to do with it, but also it's almost like having something. First of all, someone, because I didn't think I was going to be able to have kids. So that was exciting in one respect, but it was also kind of scary at the same time. And being aware all of a sudden that I was about to have the responsibility of an entire human who can't provide for himself itself. At the time, I had no idea whether it be a boy or girl at first. And also the level of awareness even that brought wasn't quite where it needed to be. But it started the significant things. I think that's where I got to a point to where my deficit, at least, was almost made up. The subsequent years after that, first 2 years, roughly speaking, of Jax's life were me trying to gain my bearings on everything around me and figure out who I am, figure out my place in the cosmos, my place in my family, my place in my mind, my own self. Like, who am I in relation to me? Who am I in relation to who I think I am? Who do I even think I am? Like, when you have no idea who you are, when you don't know yourself, and you realize all of a sudden that over 20 years old, like 22-ish, something like that, that you have lived your entire life and you don't even know who you are yourself, much less be an integrated, mature adult. It can be jarring, but this is not where it ends exactly, because waking up is only the beginning. Even symbolically, when do you wake up? You wake up in the morning, right? you've still got your entire day ahead of you. When you wake up, the entire point, symbolically speaking, but also biologically, socially, however you want to look at it or describe it, when you wake up, you're supposed to be energized, refreshed. Your brain's supposed to have rewired itself based on new connections formed the previous day, which is how learning actually takes place. Yes, it happens during REM sleep, not actually when you're consuming the information. That's a sidebar there. Interesting educational neuroscientific fact there. But that's when the regeneration, the healing, the processing and storage of memory and data information, that's when it all happens, is when you're asleep. And then you wake up and you start from there. And so my great awakening, or let's say the crucifixion story equivalent of Project 1121, would be the genesis of my exploration of philosophy. Me developing a reading habit again and digging into philosophy, learning critical thinking and argumentation and logic, epistemology, rationality. Studying these things helped me get a grasp on the reality that I had been asleep to my entire life. And this is an invaluable tool. This is an invaluable thing to have access to, philosophy, that is, and critical thinking, when you're a grown man who has never learned how to think for himself. So this is the process. But there are some things to keep in mind. Once you embark on this process, you cannot turn back, and nor will you ever want to. You may feel like you want to sometimes. You may feel extremely discouraged, suffer. There's a lot that's going to come behind it. There's going to be a lot of psychological anguish too. And God forbid you're one of the ones whose family who has cultivated your lack of independent and critical thought and awareness over your lifespan. You're going to have all the people who matter most to you working counterproductive to you, who may even serve a greater purpose of pulling you backward or holding you back than they even do encouraging you to move forward and do better for yourself, which also may even include doing better for them. But because they don't know, you must forgive them, for they know not what they do, and love them anyways, and do it anyways. This is a burden, sure, it is, but it's one that I share. It's one that I carry, personally. The people you love most don't believe in you. You're accustomed to not believing in yourself. It's very easy to just be like, is there something to this? Do they see something I don't in me? Especially if you already have more of an inclination or proclivity to insecurity, let's say. You have to plug yourself on a charger and say, no matter what, I'm at least staying at 1%. The phone can't die. I may stay on this charger for a week. I may stay here for a year. But I'm not going to die. I'll at least hold 1%. And as long as you can do that, accept and embrace failure, accept and embrace the pain and the suffering, both physical and psychological, that's going to come behind your awakening, and you realize that nothing that you ever get in life that is genuinely worth sacrificing something for or living for that matter, none of it's going to come without suffering. I mean, life itself exists only in conjunction with pain and suffering. Joy and pleasure presuppose pain and suffering. Joy and pleasure would not be joyful or pleasurable without the existence of pain and suffering. It's necessary. And it's going to intensify once you open your eyes. So someone might ask, well, you describe it as a process of pain and suffering. Why would anyone choose that? And it's the same exact reason why anyone would choose the red pill as opposed to the blue pill in the Matrix movie. If you know that the reality you live in is composed of a bunch of bodies that are being used essentially as empty vessels or empty shells of a false projected reality, and they're no more in reality than a brain in a vat, but they live in a world that seems visceral and real and lively, and you have the option to either go back to the fake world knowing that it's not real, or go and fight the system, refuse the fake world, and value truth and reality over it. What are you going to choose? And what you choose says a lot about your character and the state of mind you're in. And I would argue from that position, especially and specifically, that it's very telling of where you are in your life. It's very telling of your perspective. It's very telling in terms of whether or not you are actually a conscious individual. Because no intelligent, aware, or conscious person would ever willingly dive back into ignorance head first. No way. I would argue that just wouldn't happen. Ignorance is only bliss for those who are actively, blissfully ignorant. Once you get a taste of the other side, you can't go back. The door becomes inaccessible. It's right there. You can reach out and open it, but you can't bring yourself to do so. So, what have we been over in this video? We covered how I also think that it's useful for others to classify this condition of mind, let's say, as a self-induced psychological prison. We went over an outline of sort of where my experience with waking up over time, aka the Project 1121 process, in terms of the genesis and exodus of the story there, of my story there in that regard, as well as the most updated conclusion that I could possibly give you from the position I'm in now. We went over some perspective things, mindset things, as in, here's some things to keep in mind when you are actively in the process of building yourself in these ways to sort of help you, again, gain your bearings and figure out your place and really put you with an advantageous head start in your journey. And that's pretty much it. That's really all I did want to hit on in this video. It's probably still gone a little longer than I planned. I tried to aim for a much shorter bullet point list of topics that I wanted to touch on for this particular video, because I've noticed that all of them, even before editing, are multiple hours in some cases, usually no less than an hour at minimum before editing. Even after editing, I don't think I have many, aside from one, maybe two within the last couple months recently, that have been less than an hour. But I do hope that I reached one of you, because again, there's multiple reasons for, even for me creating this video, there's multiple reasons, but one of the first and foremost is, look around us. Do you live in contemporary Western culture? I mean, maybe you don't, but 9 times out of 10, if you're watching this video, you probably live in the United States. So that in mind, look at your culture. Is this what you want? This what you want for your kids? Do you have kids? Do you plan on having kids? If you had kids, would this be a culture or society that you would be okay with them being raised in? Because it starts in the home. All of it starts in the home. And it starts within yourself, even within the home. You have to start with you. Like Michael Jackson said, and he said it best, you got to start with the man in the mirror, because everything flows downstream from there. If we all did that, the world would change. Imagine if we just got enough people to do that, to make a difference. The world can still be changed.